Today we're going to cover some more video game series that lost the plot when naming their sequels. If you guys know of any that are extremely inconsistent with how they name their games, let me know in a comment and maybe I'll feature them in an upcoming video. And before we begin, remember to subscribe if you haven't, and hit the bell icon if you've enjoyed the video. It helps support the channel and lets me know if you want to see more. And with that spiel out of the way, let's begin. The first series we'll look at is the somewhat niche Valkyria Chronicles. Sporting gorgeous anime-style visuals, unique turn-based strategy elements, and a really awesome alternate universe take on World War II, the first title's success spawned not just a series, but an entire franchise, which resulted in a manga, a spin-off, a mobile game, characters being featured in crossovers, tons of figurines, and even an anime adaptation. When the second game released, appropriately titled Valkyria Chronicles 2, it killed off a lot of momentum for the series outside of Japan. Fans were expecting the sequel to release on consoles, but instead, because Sony's PlayStation Portable was selling like hotcakes around this time, Valkyria Chronicles 2 was developed for that instead. It sold well enough in Japan to warrant another sequel, however, because it performed so poorly in the West, Sega decided to keep the newest game a Japan-only exclusive, even though it was exactly what Western fans wanted the entire time. And because we never saw an official release of Valkyria Chronicles 3, it led to a very interesting conundrum when the unexpected sequel was localized as Valkyria Chronicles 4. So on top of the Western audience missing a mainline game in the series, which many claim to be the best, the localized name for 4 wasn't altered to accommodate the missing entry, which in my opinion was the correct play considering the alternatives. They would have either had to make up another subtitle or just name it Valkyria Chronicles 3 and hope they don't find themselves in the same situation as Square did with early Final Fantasy. Looking at the second and fourth games for a moment, we also have another issue that was obvious from the start if you were paying attention. The second title contains a Roman numeral, while the fourth uses a number, and the constant back and forth between numbers and Roman numerals is actually a very common trend when it comes to gaming companies naming their sequels. And it's present in the next one we'll look at, which also has a few problems of its own. Next is Mortal Kombat. The first game, Mortal Kombat, was followed by Mortal Kombat 2, with 2 being represented by Roman numerals. But when the third game released, they switched from using Roman numerals to numbers, and from there things got hectic, because following 3 came 2 upgraded versions of it titled Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, and then the poorly named Mortal Kombat Trilogy, which sounds like it would be a collection of the first 3 games, but in actuality is another version of 3 mixing fighters and stages from the previous 2. And after Trilogy came the first 3D game in the series, Mortal Kombat 4, and 2 years later, an updated version called Mortal Kombat Gold, which was sold exclusively for the Dreamcast. What followed were several titles that used generic violent words like Deadly Alliance, Deception, and Armageddon. Then in 2008, to the surprise of pretty much everyone, literally nobody saw this one coming, Mortal Kombat had a crossover with DC Comics, calling this bizarre amalgamation Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. This game would not only be the first in the series to receive a T rating instead of M, but it was also the last game Midway developed before the franchise was sold to Warner Brothers. With that oddity out of the way, Mortal Kombat saw a reboot with great success with Mortal Kombat. Now, imagine this. You know the series was just rebooted and a sequel is on its way. You're in charge of naming that next entry. So what do you think would be the most appropriate title to give it? Mortal Kombat 2 maybe? Well, apparently not, because instead of doing the most logical thing, Warner Brothers named the reboot sequel Mortal Kombat X, because it's the 10th game in the series. Not that you know, they stopped numbering them after 4. And remember, that wasn't even in Roman numerals. So not only did they exclude numbering the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th games, when they eventually returned to numbering them, they went with a completely different numeric system. What makes Mortal Kombat X, or 10, however you want to call it, a top contender in sequel naming retardation is that despite being a direct sequel to the reboot, they named the game as if the reboot never happened. So to recap, they went from using Roman numerals to numbers, to leaving out the number from 5 games, to switching back to Roman numerals and numbering it as if it was part of the series before the reboot, even though it's the reboot's direct sequel. But wait, it gets worse. For Mortal Kombat X's sequel, they named the new one Mortal Kombat 11, but went back to using numbers. And it's not over yet, because after that, they rebooted the series a second time. But since they couldn't call this one Mortal Kombat, because then they'd have 3 Mortal Kombats, they named it Mortal Kombat 1 instead, as if it actually makes a fucking difference. If they call the sequel to this second reboot Mortal Kombat 2, I'm gonna have a fucking stroke. Somebody, please help these people. Another American company that went out of its way to ignore simple and consistent naming conventions is Naughty Dog. Now, I've already covered them in the last video when talking about Crash Bandicoot, but did you know that they double dipped again with the Jak and Daxter series? The first game, Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy, was a colorful platformer reminiscent of Donkey Kong 64 and Banjo-Kazooie, and the series was originally planned to stay that way, but due to market trends favoring more mature games following the release of GTA 3, Naughty Dog remolded its sequel into one that was dark, violent, and edgy. To reflect the drastic change in the series' tone, Naughty Dog dropped and Daxter from the title because according to them, it sounded too childish, and they just decided to call the second game Jak II. In PAL regions, to reinforce the edgy, grittier theme, they added Renegade as a subtitle for some reason. After Jak II came Jak III, and here we fucking go again, they're switching the numbering system. I don't know why this happens so often. Adding more onto this mess, the sequel to Jak III was called Jak X Combat Racing, which appears to use the Roman numeral 10, but the reality is they didn't. The X doesn't stand for 10, it's just the letter X. See, during the early 2000s, there was this weird trend of the letter X being shoehorned into things to make them look cool and mature, like video game titles and online usernames. That's why back in the day, you'd see people unironically running around with names like this. Getting back on track, only after Jak X did Daxter find his way back into the titles of the games, first returning in the PSP spin-off exclusive Daxter, and then later the fifth and final installment, which also returned to using subtitles. That one was called Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier. The last series we'll look at today is Resident Evil, which has been making headlines recently due to its newest game trailer. Before I started writing the script, I thought this was a series that wouldn't make the cut, but man was I dead wrong. Resident Evil, Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 3 are ordered sequentially, and they don't switch between using Roman numerals and numbers, so that's a huge plus. This is like the first time in the video where this hasn't happened in the first 3 games. But 3 does have a subtitle, so I need to deduct a point there. But other than that, the trilogy is otherwise 95% consistent. Good job. I just wish this lasted a bit longer, because the next 2 mainline games were not Resident Evil 4 and 5 like you'd expect, but instead Resident Evil Code Veronica and Resident Evil 0. The former using a subtitle but dropping the number, and the latter using a number but it's spelled out. Outside of Japan, the number 0 is only part of the logo, and that makes me very upset because they were so fucking close on getting back on track with this one. The following 3 games, Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, were perfect. No subtitles, no switching number systems, no spelling out numbers, pure consistency, everything is good. It can't get any better than this, and in fact, it never did, because the next game's title made the series lose any resemblance of naming consistency for the foreseeable future. Resident Evil 7 not only added back a subtitle, it represented its number as a Roman numeral in the logo, despite the official wording for the title containing the number 7, and the next game took it one step further. Resident Evil 8 copied 7 using the same gimmick, with Roman numerals being part of the game's logo and title, except this game's written title excluded the number 8 completely. Resident Evil 8 isn't Resident Evil 8 Village, it's just Resident Evil Village, and the Village isn't even a subtitle. So this is another one of those cases like Crash 3, where technically the game does have a number, it's in the timeline of games, it is one of the mainline entries, the number is in the logo, and it's very clearly visible this time, unlike Crash 3, but on paper, the number's not there. And it looks like Resident Evil 9 is doomed to repeat the same mistake, because yet again, Capcom is using part of the game's title, this time the subtitle, to represent which numbered entry it is in the series. Somebody really needs to set Capcom straight. I'm dead fucking serious. Let's go over this one more time. We have Resident Evil, Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Overall, minus the subtitle, these are consistent. But then Capcom loses the plot and names the sequel Resident Evil Code Veronica, which kept the subtitle but dropped the number. Then Resident Evil 0 comes out, which is a prequel to Resident Evil 1, dropping the subtitle and using a number again, only this time it's spelled out as a word. Then Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 show up, trying to save the day, only to be blindsided by Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, which not only comes out with a subtitle, but uses Roman numerals despite the written name of the entry having a number. Then we have Resident Evil 8, which isn't even called Resident Evil 8, but instead Resident Evil Village. This one also using Roman numerals to represent its place in the series, except that's only on the box art. And then we have the upcoming Resident Evil 9 Requiem, which, like the previous game, isn't officially called 9, and uses part of the subtitle to represent the number in the series. However, in this case, it returns to numbers. Did you get all that? We didn't even touch on the Japanese side of things, which has its own issues and differences between the North American and European names. We also didn't cover the spin-offs like Resident Evil Revelations, which had a fucking typo in the North American box art. This kind of shit drives me up the wall. Where's the quality control? What the fuck is Capcom smoking? The Resident Evil series has got to be one of the worst when it comes to keeping consistent with its naming format. It started off well, went a little off course, tried fixing itself, but in the end, threw it all away because why the fuck not? There's really no explanation for this. And with that, I think it's best that we end the video here. Do you know of any other series, or hell, even a franchise that went completely bonkers when naming their sequels? Let me know in a comment, and while you're at it, if you would be so kind as to subscribe and hit the bell icon, I would really appreciate it. If you want to keep up with what I'm doing, maybe see what's in store, feel free to follow me on Shitter and join my Discord. Links for those are in the description. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.